Special thanks to Kara and Ellie and Acacia and Sarah and Emma for reading scripture. They are 5 of several of our Elizabethtown College students who come across almost every Sunday morning to spend time with us during faith formation and worship. And so I'm grateful in this last week of the semester that they dug deep and were willing to read scripture this morning. Advent is an interesting time. It seems like this season begins to awaken in mid-October and roars to life on the day after Thanksgiving. With the world newly bathed in twinkle lights and giant inflatable snowmen, Christmas music and tinkling bells outside Walmart, wish lists and Amazon's one-click buy now shopping. And in the midst of this, here on this first Sunday morning of Advent, it seems like a good time to talk about the end of the world. How festive. But I think there are reasons which we might uncover together. Our scripture this morning is from the 3rd and final chapter of 2 Peter, a short book, one where we don't really spend a lot of time, perhaps for obvious reasons. Date-wise, it is probably the latest book written in the New Testament, composed at the end of the 1st century or the beginning of the 2nd century, so we're talking about 75 to 100 years after the life of Jesus, potentially. And it is in the style of a letter, as you heard, attributed to Peter, but not to any specific church, as we often see in Paul's writings. There are actually several other writings in the tradition of Peter that did not make it into the biblical canon, which share some similarities with this 2 Peter text. One of those is a separate writing called the Apocalypse of Peter, which includes very vivid descriptions of the beauty and rewards of heaven and the horrific fiery torment of hell, making this morning's focus scripture look pretty gentle in comparison. So here's just a snippet from that Apocalypse of Peter text, which again is not in the Bible, but it's in the same genre and style. And this is verses 27, 28, and 29. And near those there were again women and men gnawing their own lips and being punished and receiving a red-hot iron in their eyes. And these were they who blasphemed and slandered the way of righteousness. And over against these again other men and women gnawing their tongues and having flaming fire in their mouths, and these were the false witnesses. And in a certain other place there were pebbles sharper than swords or any spit red hot, and women and men in tattered and filthy raiment rolled around on them in punishment. And these were the rich who trusted in their riches and had no pity for orphans and widows and despised the commandment of God. And that's a pretty tame snippet from the Apocalypse of Peter. There is some other even more potent description in that text, which you can find on a website called earlychristianwritings.com if you have nothing else to do this afternoon. But here in 2 Peter, we have a little less specific and vibrant imagery, but still some pretty clear description about what is to come. In chapter 3, verse 10 that we heard in a slightly different version, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a loud noise, and the elements will be dissolved with fire, and the earth and everything that is done on it will be disclosed." The forecast for the world is dire, and these future events are explicitly tied in 2 Peter to the activity of God. The writings attributed to Peter are arising out of an apocalyptic vision, and I'll talk about that word apocalyptic in a second, which I have way more times than I will be able to correctly pronounce in this sermon manuscript. But this vision is where those who have done wrong will be punished, and those who have done right will be rewarded, ultimately emerging out of a desire, this writing, to guide readers toward obedience and piety. So the word apocalypse means, in the original Greek verb form, to uncover. The goal of authors writing in an apocalyptic tone is to uncover the events of the world and reveal or unveil what is understood to be true, real, larger than us, the spiritual reasoning, the cause and effect that can be found according to Peter, underneath that explains the activity that is happening. We see this in other biblical texts too, including the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible, and perhaps most popularly or famously in Revelation at the end of the New Testament. But I would also suggest we see this apocalyptic thought in modern times. I think of the devastation after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and I remember some Christian leaders vocalizing the disaster as evidence of the end times and punishment for wicked behavior. I think of those who theologically explain climate change or certain political election results and leaders in terms that ground them in divine activity of reward and punishment. For some, and for our author of 2 Peter, this style of writing is an attempt to motivate people to action. For others who encounter apocalypticism, it feels like an acknowledgement that there's nothing that can be done since everything is set into motion by divine powers. Throw up the hands, oh well. And for others, this sort of apocalyptic language is simply a turnoff, seen as unrealistic, unhelpful, or even ridiculous. It is unlikely that this letter that we know as 2 Peter was actually written by Peter. It is more likely that this was written by a later follower of Peter's perspective or Peter's school of thought. And one reason for this explanation of authorship is scholars' understanding of when this piece was likely written. So I mentioned that it has probably been dated to the later 1st or early 2nd century, and that would be after the first couple of generations of believers had passed on. Those earliest generations were the ones who were most strongly believing that Jesus' return was imminent any day now. But it is clear in 2 Peter, namely by the fact that it hasn't happened yet, that the strength of that belief has weakened. Jesus is coming soon, you say? Well, I'll believe it when I see it. And the generation at this time of this letter is feeling much less confident that they're going to see it, because everyone thought it would have happened by now. This author is laying it out there for the readers or hearers. I'm reminding you. Stirring up your memory is one of the phrases in chapter 1. Here's what we've been taught, that Christ is coming back. And in the meantime, there are some teachers telling you the wrong stuff. There are people, scoffers, who are going to say, we haven't seen any evidence of that. This is obviously a whole bunch of rubbish. Sometimes I feel a little bit like a scoffer. Do I wonder if I will be on the destruction or the reward end of this equation? Do I believe in God the right way? I can certainly name all kinds of things that I should have, could have, would have done differently in my life, and the list will probably be longer tomorrow. The fear and threat of the end times that so many people feel, which seems to emerge as the focus of this text, is in some ways puzzling to me. I absolutely acknowledge that life is not easy for many. Some feel like they are in the middle of a world burning down right this very minute. Personal tragedies and loss, physical and mental and emotional challenges, grief that doesn't end, ramifications of unfortunate happenings or poor decisions, micro close attention to the tragedies and difficulties around the globe. All of these uncover feelings that the end is near. We've seen a world on fire for our siblings in Nigeria over the past decade or more. We imagine the world feels like it's melting down for our neighbors in Palestine and Israel and Ukraine and Russia and Syria and Afghanistan and Haiti, and I could probably go on. So when I think about the ways in which our world feels like it is in jeopardy, be it from interpersonal violence or the dangerous precipice of nuclear war or the continued decline of our global environment, the elements being on fire doesn't seem so far-fetched. And yet at the same time, there is so much beauty in the world, so much good Look at the intricacy of a snowflake, the petals of a flower, the gentle smile of a baby. Feel the hugs from a loved one, the vibrating purr of a kitten in your lap, the warmth of a fire. Notice the spark of excitement with a new idea, the joy that emerges from connection with another human, the peace of a restful sleep. I'm not saying this passage is necessarily about war or climate change, but I am saying that this passage and all of the sacred texts, in fact, are constantly viewed through the lens of context. For late 1st and 2nd century ancient people living with the hope of Jesus' return, a return which they understood would bring a rightness to their world, a rectification of wrongs to those who have harmed them, and a restoration of God's relationship with humanity through Jesus' reign, for these early followers of Jesus, it was just a matter of time. But time marches on, and it starts to become apparent that the anticipated return isn't happening as quickly as they thought. It is hard to wait. We wait and wait. And when the thing for which we wait does not seem to happen, we get frustrated. Why hasn't that waiter come back to take our order yet? Why have I seen 6 shuttle buses for the other parking lots and none for the parking lot where my car is located? Why are all the grocery lines overflowing with 3 empty stations and no employees in them? Why am I still waiting to meet a best friend or a life partner? Why is this semester taking so long? But here's the thing. This Peter follower author says, God's time isn't like our time. God's time is different. With the Lord, a single day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a single day. I feel like I understand that a little differently now, post-COVID. I don't know how many times I've said to someone, time is funny now, as I'm attempting to recall an event, and I literally cannot remember if it was 2 months ago or 2 years ago. Maybe that's happened to you. But in 2 Peter, we are reminded that God's time isn't like our time and isn't like COVID time. It's not that God is late. 2 Peter says to the early audience, it's that we are expecting God to operate on our timeline, with our calendar, in our understanding of hours and days and weeks and months. And maybe it's not the same chronological system that God uses. And also of note, part of this difference in God time is intentional. It's intentionally providing an opportunity for any and all to change their hearts and lives and find this new way of life. There may come a time when there are no more opportunities to make that change, but for now, in the present, God waits for us. In the spirit of 2 Peter, even though it's taking longer than expected, at some point, the heavens and the earth, as we think we understand it, will be destroyed, and a new heaven and a new earth will arise. In the meantime, what are we, people, to do while we wait? What sort of people ought you to be, we read. Well, says 2 Peter, live holy and godly lives. Be pure and faultless, living in peace. Maybe that's a glimpse of the return of Jesus for which we wait. Maybe the evidence of the sacred in our eyes and ears and hearts and hands and feet is the beginning of the return of Jesus to the world. And so here we are in the season of Advent, this season of waiting and preparation and wonder once again. Each year, year after year, we take this time to remember and recognize God's act of infusing humanity with love. God's act of incarnation, bringing the essence of God's divine nature into the body of the very human Jesus. God's act of starting something new, exposing the possibility that all things can become new, revealing this reality of heaven and earth united. I don't know what the end will look like, the end of my life or your life or this planet. I don't know if that will be tomorrow or 20 years from now or 1,000 years more. But I do know that things end. Jobs end. Relationships end. Lives end. Seasons end. Sometimes it's expected. Sometimes it's not. And the question remains whether we're talking about the end of humanity or sunset this evening. What do we do while we are waiting? What sort of people ought we be? What does a holy and godly life look like? We can write this apocalyptic imagery off as bad or outdated theology, an understanding of the way the world works that really isn't compatible with more modern understandings of science. We can explain it as figurative language or allegory or hyperbole, and it very well may be any or all of those things. But I think it's important to remember that this text was written to a church in transition, between one understanding of a chosen people to a widening and openness to Gentiles, a transition from those who had been closer in time to the events of Jesus' life to those who were further distanced from the apostles. A transition from patient waiting for Jesus' return at any moment to a reality where waiting has become the norm and does not appear to have an end in sight. We too are a church in transition. The church more broadly is experiencing significant change as more and more Americans are claiming that church as we have known it is not an essential part of their daily or weekly lives. Many are demonstrating that both by less frequent attendance in Sunday morning worship and by responses on surveys where they choose none, N-O-N-E, to describe their religious affiliation. We've experienced in this congregation significant transition over the last couple of years in our pastoral and music staffing. We've almost had a transition of how we present ourselves as we've become more visible and vocal in our local community, identifying who we are and what is important to us, especially in areas of social justice and openness. For me, this transition nudges me to ask what I think are really essential questions about the nature of church. I often ask, I feel like a broken record sometimes, what is church becoming? Our Sunday morning worship experience is a primary piece of our church life, and also, is there something else? What is church beyond 10:30 on Sunday morning? What is church in addition to inviting people to join us here? How might we join faithful, spiritual people out there? We are always a church in transition, a people in transition. And I think if we are truly listening for and proclaiming the good news of Jesus, that will always be the case. Because that is how God makes all things new. All things are not new when they stay the same. All things are new when we remain open and receptive to the sacred movement of the Spirit. All things are new when we recognize that there will come at some point an end, which will be followed by a new beginning. All things are new when we remember that God's presence and guidance and wisdom is available to us, and not just to us, to all. If we lean into our own patience, modeled after God's timeless patience, striving to live holy lives modeled after God's holy character, and making every effort to be found by God in peace with all, without spot or blemish, say some translations, with nothing to hide, uncovered, not because we fear what might happen in the end, but because we live within the wonder and mystery of the hope found in God's healing and generative salvation that is available today and for 1,000 years to come. May it be so.